because of people like this that show young, impressionable kids, and I mean they are kids, they're 17, yes, they're an adult, but they're still children, that having drugs in their possession, and I'm not, these are harsh drugs, that it's acceptable in society. And that's what she learned by staying with this fellow, that, it's happening here. It's like, having a glass of wine at dinner is socially acceptable in some people's houses and not in others. I guess my question is, is this really socially acceptable? Personally, I believe that the laws should be stiffer. That people like this will get away with this kind of behavior. In my opinion, I think that some of the dealers are really just getting a slap on the hand. I don't believe that they're not taking responsibility for the actions that they have done. So the death of Chelsea's not only left a hole in our family, but also in our community. And I think that's an important thing to recognize as well. I am here as a mother talking about the loss of my daughter and what drugs have done to our family, but it's also what these drugs have done to our community. We've lost a member of our community that was inspiring, that was fun, that was caring, and she was just an amazing child. I have brought with me some paper, some statistics, just to give you an idea. It's the sheet here, an idea of what the community of Whitehorse, excuse me. So I want to point out that in 2009, when my daughter died, these are some of the stats. Drug possession charges in the Supreme Court of the Yukon alone were 15,984. 8,106 were found guilty, and 59 were acquitted. For the same year, for drug trafficking, the number of cases that came before the court, 12,587, of which 7,230 were found guilty. I would like to stress the fact that Whitehorse is a population of approximately 25,000 people. I've lost my daughter, and I can't imagine having any other families go through what I've done. Thank you. Sorry.
You don't need to be sorry, Ms. Anderson. We're the ones who are sorry. We're the ones who are sorry. This is, we know, horribly difficult for you, and there aren't words to express our sympathy, but we're very grateful. It's important for us to hear from people with stories like yours.
A lot from organizations and people who deal directly with these folks. And I really wanted to stress that there's families out there that have lost families because of this. And it's another side to look at when you're looking at bills like this.
Thank you very much. Okay? All right. So we'll go now to questions, beginning with Senator Wallace, who will be followed by Senator Lang and Senator Boisvenu. Senator Wallace?
Chair, would you mind if Senator Lang went
You're
first?
Going to pass?
Yes.
The next on the list is Senator Lang. Senator Lang.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Tracey Anderson for coming before the committee and and I know how difficult this must be for you, but I think it's very important that we as a committee and Parliament hear the real human side of what these drugs do to families and to Canadians. And I think there's another important aspect that's being presented here, and the fact is that these drugs are not just in Vancouver, not just in Halifax, they're in rural Canada, and probably in some cases more prevalent in rural Canada than perhaps in some other areas of the urban community that you know in southern Canada. And the question that has to be asked, how do we curb that? And that's the reason for the bill that's before us. I think your presentation, and I just want to go on this line of questioning if I could, you talk about the court system and appearance of these people who are known, who go to the court system, are repeat offenders, and they get a slap in the wrist and they come back out on the street. And there seems to be no consequence to their action. And perhaps if I could ask Ms. Anderson if she could maybe expand it a little bit further on her, from her point of view as a mother, and a mother who's lost a daughter in a situation that just can only be called tragic.
A situation that happened a few months after my daughter had passed away. My husband is a courier, and he was called to a residence to pick up an envelope. And the fellow opened the door and said that in the envelope contained a check, a very, very large check for his lawyer, and that it was nothing, and that he was up on drug trafficking charges and that he would get off scot-free. Not knowing who my husband was, just blatantly saying this, and statements like that, personally, they have no respect for the law. They really don't care what's going on in their community. They're there to make money. And, besides the fact that my husband drove around the corner and broke down after hearing this, it's part of his job. He has to carry on doing what he does. In our community, being a smaller community, we face these individuals every day. And, for my daughter, no charges were ever formally laid, because at the scene there wasn't enough drugs on the scene to prosecute. Both her boyfriend and her father or his father is walking the streets, living a normal life. I don't know what else to tell you about that. It's frustrating. It's heart-wrenching. And it's a hard community to live in when you see things like that, knowing that they're there to do this again.
Just one further question. One further question in reference to the legislation that's before Parliament. With the strengthening of the justice system, with the addition of now what would be seen as mandatory sentencing, do you think this is a step in the right direction, and do you feel that, from your perspective of coming from a smaller community in Canada, that if one of these individuals are prosecuted, are found guilty, and they are put away for a period of time, that it will help make the community more secure?
I do, definitely. I think that having minimum penalties along with education programs, I think would be a really good combination, personally. These people need to be taken off the street and removed from the situation that they are dealing in to break those ties, as far as I'm I've been listening how others will move into their position and whatnot, but I think if the penalties are strong enough, that's going to definitely, make people stop and think, is it really worth it?
Thank you, Senator Lyons. Senator Beauvenu.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mrs. Anderson, I'd like to offer my most sincere sympathy to you. My daughter was killed by a recidivist who did have drug problems, who had committed crimes previously, and the system simply gave him a slap on the wrist saying, don't do it again. So I can understand the kind of frustration you experience and the fact that you have expectations from the Conservative government in strengthening the provisions and sending out a clear message. My question here then is for Ms. Lyons. I was rather surprised to see in your statement that you were saying that we would be putting consumers in prison, and that if a young person gives a pill to another person, that the person could receive a sentence, a prison sentence. I'd like to know whether you did read this bill correctly, and do you think that you understand it correctly?
I understand that we're talking about trafficking, absolutely. I read the bill numerous times and have presented in its other form on C-15. And I don't know when I said that we were putting consumers in prison. I think you may be referring to when I was giving the section about, in section, can I just refer to my paper so I don't mess it up? Referring to section 1A2C and 1A2A, where I'm talking about if a person, you know, a 19-year-old is at a rave with their friends who are 17, for example. I wasn't talking about the 17-year-old being giving the mandatory minimum sentence. I was referring to the 19-year-old who's still a young person, and that was going along with my point that especially if we're talking about places on or near a schoolyard or presumably a rave, that's a place where young people frequent, it would be subject to the aggravating factor of the 2-year mandatory minimum sentence. Does that make sense? Does that clarify? Or?
What you did say, you made two statements. You said a young person gives a pill to another person. You said if a young person gives a pill to another young person, then will receive a 7-year sentence. I don't see any crime or offense there. The bill will affect all sorts of people, people who consume the most. What I'm trying to understand is the link that you're establishing between the consumption of the drug and the bill, whereas when the bill applies specifically to dealers.
The section that I believe you're referring to is about the rescheduling. And so my understanding, and I read this from other transcripts as well and from other legal people in here, and that's why I gave the example of the Senator Baker and Sergeant Sadler, was that if we have MDMA, for example, that's rescheduled into a Schedule 1, then therefore it becomes a possession charge, right? I believe Senator Banks was giving a similar analogy beforehand, and that's where I was referring to. I apologize that I misunderstood you the first time.
Baker avait une question supplémentaire.
Okay, j'ai terminé, Madame la Présidente.
C'est bien, c'est bien. Senator Baker?
Just a supplementary. I think your point was that if you take all of these drugs from Schedule 3, put them up to Schedule 1,
Yes.
then your possession goes from a possible 3 years to 7 years.
Exactly.
And so you were saying that's what you were implying.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. Sorry, I apologize for
And you're correct.
Yeah.
You're correct.
I had a question to put to you, Ms. Lyons, and indeed to Ms. Anderson, if you're interested in answering it, but in particular to you, Ms. Lyons, as I expect you're aware, there's been some discussion around the table, including the last panel of witnesses, about the whole question of near a school. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that issue, because clearly there is a public interest in trying to protect children from purveyors of dangerous substances in places where they're going to be on a habitual basis, particularly schools. But there has been some testimony and some indication in case law that it's very difficult to achieve that purpose without sweeping up, casting too broad a net. Have you got any thoughts about that? Have your members discussed this?